In the harsh winter of 1868, when the American frontier was still wild and unforgiving, a mother's love would be tested beyond measure. Cast out into the wilderness with her twin daughters by the very people she once called neighbors, Elizabeth Winters faced certain death in the bitter cold of the Wyoming Territory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would defy everything she had been taught to believe about the native people who called these lands home long before settlers arrived. This is the extraordinary true story of how compassion can be found in the most unexpected places, and how one Cheyenne chief's decision to help a desperate mother would change the course of several lives forever. Join us as we uncover this forgotten chapter of American history, a tale of cruelty, courage, and the profound humanity that can bridge even the deepest cultural divides. The settlement of Crawford's Mill was barely a speck on the map of the Wyoming Territory in 1868. Nestled between rolling hills and the winding Powder River, it comprised just 23 cabins, a general store, and a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse. The settlers who called this place home had come west seeking opportunity and land, carrying with them dreams of prosperity along with deeply ingrained prejudices. Among these settlers was the Winters family, Jonathan, Elizabeth, and their twin 7-year-old daughters, Sarah and Hannah. Unlike many who had traveled west, the Winters hadn't come seeking fortune. Jonathan, a skilled carpenter, had been recruited specifically to help build and expand the young settlement. Elizabeth Winters was 32 years old, with auburn hair that she kept neatly pinned beneath modest bonnets, and gentle hands that belied their strength. Once the daughter of a respected Boston schoolteacher, she had brought with her a small collection of books from which she taught her daughters to read. The twins, with their matching blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair, were known throughout the settlement for their sweet dispositions and the way they finished each other's sentences. Jonathan Winters was a quiet, principled man who had fought briefly in the Civil War before a minor injury sent him home. While not outspoken in his views, he differed from many of his neighbors in his belief that the native tribes deserved to be treated with respect. This opinion, though rarely voiced publicly, had not gone unnoticed by certain influential members of the settlement. Life in Crawford's Mill followed the predictable rhythms of frontier existence. Men worked from sunrise to sunset, building new structures, hunting and tending to livestock. Women maintained households under challenging conditions, preserving food for the harsh winters, making clothing and caring for children. The Winters family, while respected for Jonathan's carpentry skills, existed somewhat on the periphery of the tight-knit community. The winter of 1868 arrived early and with unusual ferocity. By mid-November, snow piled high against cabin walls, and temperatures plummeted to dangerous lows. Game became scarce, and the settlement's food stores began to dwindle faster than anticipated. It was during this time that illness struck Crawford's Mill like a thief in the night. The sickness began with a persistent cough that ravaged the lungs and brought high fevers. Within days, 3 of the settlement's eldest residents had succumbed, followed by 2 young children. Fear gripped the community as more fell ill, including Jonathan Winters. Elizabeth tended to her husband day and night, applying cool compresses to his burning forehead and forcing sips of herbal tea between his cracked lips. The twins were kept away for fear they too would fall ill. For 6 days, Jonathan fought the illness, his powerful frame weakening with each passing hour. On the 7th morning, as the sun cast pale light through frost-covered windows, Jonathan Winters drew his final breath, his hand clasped tightly in his wife's. "Promise me you'll keep them safe," he had whispered hours before, referring to their daughters. "Promise me you'll find a way." Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, my love," I promise." Word of Jonathan's death spread quickly through the settlement. As was customary, neighbors arrived to help prepare the body and offer support to the widow and her children. Elizabeth received their condolences with quiet dignity, her grief held tightly within, saved for the private hours when she could weep silently into her pillow so as not to frighten her daughters. What Elizabeth didn't know was that whispers had already begun, poisonous and persistent, started by Sherman Crawford, the settlement's founder and unofficial leader. Crawford was a bull of a man with a thick beard and cold eyes that rarely revealed his thoughts. He had never cared for Jonathan Winters, whose educated manners and moderate views on native tribes ran counter to Crawford's belief that all Indians were savages who stood in the way of rightful progress. Now, with supplies running low and fear of the illness still gripping the settlement, Crawford saw an opportunity. Winters was the first to fall ill after trading with Cheyenne 2 weeks back, he murmured to a group of men gathered in the general store. Brought that sickness into our midst. This was a lie. The illness had actually begun with Crawford's own cousin, who had traveled from a settlement 60 miles east, but few would dare contradict him. "And now we've got 3 less mouths to feed," added Silas Tanner, Crawford's right-hand man, referring to the recent deaths. "But 3 more that ain't contributing nothing." His meaning was clear. Elizabeth and her daughters were now seen as burdens. That evening, as Elizabeth sat by the fire mending one of Sarah's dresses, a knock came at the door. Opening it, she found 4 men standing in the snow. Crawford, Tanner, and 2 others whose faces were partially obscured by scarves. "Mrs. Winters," Crawford said, removing his hat with false courtesy, "we've come to discuss your situation." Elizabeth invited them in, though everything within her wanted to shut the door against the cold calculation she saw in their eyes. "The settlement has taken a vote," Crawford announced without preamble once they were inside. "With supplies running low and winter upon us, decisions have had to be made regarding the allocation of resources." Elizabeth's hands tightened around the fabric she still held. "What decisions?" "It's been determined that those who cannot contribute to the survival of the settlement cannot remain here," Tanner said flatly. "You and your girls will need to leave by tomorrow morning." The world seemed to tilt beneath Elizabeth's feet. "Leave? In this weather? That's a death sentence, and you know it?" Crawford's expression remained impassive. "Your husband brought sickness to our community, Mrs. Winters. Some might say you're lucky we're not seeking more severe consequences." "That's a lie," Elizabeth said, her voice finding strength in defense of her husband. "Jonathan never—" "The decision is final," Crawford interrupted. "You'll be provided with a wagon, 1 horse, and enough provisions for a week. There's a military outpost 3 days' journey east. That's more charity than many would show. My daughters are just children," Elizabeth pleaded, her mind racing with the impossibility of the journey they proposed. "Should have thought of that before your husband traded with those savages," one of the other men muttered. Elizabeth looked from face to face, searching for any sign of compassion or doubt. Finding none, she realized the truth. This had nothing to do with the illness or supplies. Crawford had wanted Jonathan gone for his views, and now saw a chance to be rid of his family as well. With Jonathan no longer alive to offer his valuable carpentry skills, Elizabeth and her daughters were expendable. "The settlement wants us gone because we're now 3 women alone," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Because we're seen as burdens rather than people." Crawford's jaw tightened. "Dawn tomorrow," he repeated. "Be ready to leave or be removed." With that, the men turned and filed out, leaving Elizabeth standing alone in the cabin's main room, the half-mended dress still clutched in her trembling hands. For several minutes, she allowed herself to feel the crushing weight of despair. Then, hearing a small sound from the loft where her daughters slept, Elizabeth straightened her shoulders and wiped away her tears. Jonathan had made her promise to keep their daughters safe, and she intended to honor that promise. Through the night, Elizabeth packed what she could: clothing, blankets, Jonathan's tools, the family Bible, and her small collection of books. She wrapped dried meat and hard biscuits and filled water skins. With each item carefully stowed, she fortified her resolve. The twins woke to find their mother dressed for travel, her face pale but determined. "Are we going somewhere, Mama?" Hannah asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Elizabeth knelt before her daughters, taking their small hands in hers. "Yes, my darlings, we're going on a journey to find a new home." "Why?" Sarah asked, always the more direct of the twins. Elizabeth hesitated, then opted for a version of the truth the children could understand. "The people here are afraid because of the sickness that took your father. They think we should leave for a while." "Will we come back?" Hannah's lower lip trembled. "I don't know," Elizabeth answered honestly. "But we'll be together. And that's what matters most." Dawn broke cold and clear. As promised, a small wagon waited outside their cabin, hitched to a single horse that looked almost as old and tired as Elizabeth felt. Crawford and several other men stood watching as Elizabeth loaded her daughters and their meager possessions. No one offered to help. No one spoke words of farewell. Only Martha Jenkins, the midwife who had helped deliver the twins, broke ranks to quickly press a small package into Elizabeth's hands. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Extra food," she whispered, "and febrifuge herbs should the girls take ill. God be with you, Elizabeth." Before Elizabeth could thank her, Martha had retreated back to the group of onlookers. With a final look at the cabin that had been their home for the past 2 years, Elizabeth clicked her tongue to set the horse in motion. The wagon creaked forward through the snow, carrying the Winters family toward an uncertain fate. The first day of travel was brutally difficult. The snow was deep, and the old horse struggled to pull the wagon through the drifts. Elizabeth had decided to head south rather than east toward the military outpost. She knew that Crawford's directions were likely intended to lead them away from any passing traders or travelers who might assist them. By nightfall, they had covered less than 10 miles. Elizabeth made camp in the shelter of a small grove of trees, building a fire and wrapping her daughters in every available blanket. The twins, sensing the gravity of their situation despite their young age, did not complain about the cold or their hunger. As they huddled together beside the fire, Sarah looked up at her mother with eyes so like her father's that Elizabeth felt her heart constrict. "Papa would be proud of how brave you're being," the little girl said solemnly. Elizabeth gathered her daughters closer. "He would be proud of all of us." That night, as the twins slept fitfully beside her, Elizabeth stared up at the star-filled sky and allowed doubt to creep in. The provisions would last a week at most. The likelihood of encountering friendly travelers in this weather was slim. And even if they did reach another settlement, who would take in a widow with 2 young children in the middle of winter? For the first time since Jonathan's death, Elizabeth Winters prayed. Not the formal prayers of Sunday service, but desperate, honest pleas for her children's survival. The second day brought deteriorating weather. Grey clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with the promise of snow. The old horse moved more slowly, its breath coming in labored puffs of steam. By mid-afternoon, fat snowflakes began to fall, quickly accumulating on the already challenging terrain. "Mama, I'm cold," Hannah whimpered, her face pinched and pale beneath her woolen bonnet. "I know, sweetheart," Elizabeth replied, draping another blanket around her daughter's shoulders. "We'll stop soon and build a warm fire." But as the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth recognized the signs of an approaching blizzard. The wind strengthened, driving the snow horizontally across their path, and visibility decreased alarmingly. They needed shelter, and soon. Just as desperation began to overwhelm her, Elizabeth spotted what appeared to be a rocky outcropping to their west. It might provide some protection from the wind and snow. "Hold tight, girls," she called, turning the wagon toward the potential shelter. They had traveled perhaps half a mile toward the rocks when the wagon's right wheel caught in a hidden crevice, cracking with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon lurched sickeningly to one side, nearly toppling. The old horse reared in alarm, breaking free of its harness and bolting into the swirling snow. "Stay in the wagon!" Elizabeth shouted to her daughters as she jumped down to assess the damage. Her heart sank as she saw the shattered wheel and the rapidly disappearing horse. They were stranded in the open prairie as a blizzard descended. Working quickly, Elizabeth gathered their most essential supplies: food, water, blankets, and matches. She helped the twins down from the crippled wagon. "We need to reach those rocks before the storm gets worse," she explained, pointing toward the dark shapes barely visible through the thickening snowfall. "We'll walk together, holding hands. Don't let go, no matter what." Sarah and Hannah nodded solemnly, their small faces taut with fear, but trusting in their mother. Elizabeth shouldered the heaviest pack, gave each girl a lighter bundle, and formed their three-person chain. Step by laborious step, they made their way toward the rocky outcropping. The wind howled around them, seeming to come from all directions. At once, snow collected on their clothing, weighing them down and soaking through layers of fabric. Elizabeth's legs burned with effort as she broke trail through deepening drifts, pulling her daughters forward by sheer force of will. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only 40 minutes, they reached the rocks. Elizabeth quickly discovered that what had appeared to be a simple outcropping was actually a series of rock formations, creating a shallow, cave-like shelter on the leeward side. "Thank God," she breathed, ushering her daughters into the relative protection of the stone alcove. The space was just large enough for the three of them to huddle together out of the direct force of the wind. Elizabeth worked to clear snow from the ground and set up their meager camp. Her fingers, stiff with cold despite her gloves, fumbled with the matches as she attempted to light a small fire using twigs and brush she had carried from their last stop. After several failed attempts, a tiny flame caught and began to grow. Elizabeth fed it carefully, knowing their lives depended on maintaining this fire through the night. The twins pressed against her, shivering violently. Elizabeth removed her own coat and wrapped it around them as an extra layer, ignoring their protests. "You need to stay warm," she insisted, rubbing their small hands between her own. As darkness fell completely, the storm intensified. Wind screamed through the rocks, occasionally driving snow into their shelter despite its protected position. Elizabeth kept the fire alive through sheer determination, feeding it precious fuel in careful measures. She did not dare sleep, knowing that if the fire died, they might not wake at all. Throughout that endless night, Elizabeth told stories to keep her daughter's spirits up. Tales of brave heroines overcoming impossible odds, of magical interventions, of spring flowers and warm sunshine. The twins drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, while Elizabeth fought against her own exhaustion. By dawn, the storm had not abated. If anything, it had strengthened, creating whiteout conditions that made travel impossible. Their situation had become dire. The food would last another 5 days with careful rationing, but exposure was the more immediate threat. Without proper shelter or adequate fuel for fire, they could not survive much longer in these temperatures. As the grey light of morning filtered through the swirling snow, Elizabeth made a difficult decision. They would remain in the relative shelter of the rocks for as long as the storm continued, conserving their strength and supplies. When, if the weather cleared, they would set out on foot, following the sun south in hopes of finding help. What Elizabeth didn't tell her daughters was that she had begun to accept the likelihood that they would not survive this ordeal. The wilderness in winter was unforgiving, and they were ill-equipped for such a journey. The cruel calculation of the Crawford's Mill settlers might prove correct after all. She and her daughters might simply disappear into the vast emptiness of the frontier, their fate unknown to anyone who might have cared. As these dark thoughts threatened to overwhelm her, Elizabeth noticed a change in the quality of light outside their shelter. The constant roar of the wind seemed to have diminished slightly. Cautiously, she moved to the edge of their rocky alcove and peered out. The snow was still falling heavily, but the wind had indeed decreased in intensity. And through the curtain of white, Elizabeth thought she saw movement. Dark shapes moving, with purpose across the prairie. Her first thought was of wolves, and fear seized her heart. But as she watched, straining her eyes against the glare of snow, she realized these shapes were too large, too deliberate in their movements. They were riders, people on horseback. For a moment, hope surged within her, then caution tempered. Who would be traveling in such weather? It could be a military patrol, traders, or it could be warriors from one of the native tribes that still moved through these territories despite increasing pressure from white settlers. Elizabeth hesitated, uncertain whether to call out or remain hidden. Jonathan had always spoken respectfully of the native peoples, insisting they were not the bloodthirsty savages portrayed in penny dreadfuls and settler stories. But she had never met any herself, and fear of the unknown warred with their desperate need for help. The decision was made for her when Sarah, having noticed her mother's attention fixed outside their shelter, came to look for herself. "Mama! People!" she cried out, her voice carrying clearly in the still air between gusts of wind. Elizabeth pulled her daughter back, but it was too late. The lead rider had turned in their direction, alerted by the child's voice. With hand signals to his companions, he changed course, heading directly toward the rock formation that sheltered the Winters family. "Stay behind me," Elizabeth instructed. Her daughters, positioning herself at the entrance to their alcove. She had Jonathan's hunting knife in her belt, but prayed she would not need to use it. As the riders drew nearer, Elizabeth could make out details through the falling snow. There were 5 of them, bundled against the cold, riding sturdy ponies that moved confidently through the deep drifts. Their dark hair was visible beneath winter hoods and wraps, and their faces bore the unmistakable features of the Plains tribes. The lead rider halted his pony about 20 feet from the rocks and raised his hand in what appeared to be a gesture of peace. Though his face was partially obscured by a wrap, his eyes were clearly visible, dark, intelligent, and assessing the strange sight before him. A white woman and 2 small girls huddled in a makeshift shelter in the middle of a blizzard. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the man spoke a few words in his native tongue that Elizabeth did not understand. When she made no response, he tried again, this time in heavily accented but understandable English. "You are lost." It wasn't a question, but Elizabeth nodded. Anyway, her arm still protectively around her daughters. "Yes," she replied, her voice hoarse from the cold and fear. "Our wagon broke. The horse ran." The man studied her silently, then looked at the twins, who peered around their mother with wide, frightened eyes. He spoke again to his companions in their language before turning back to Elizabeth. "Storm comes worse," he said, gesturing to the sky. "You die here." Elizabeth swallowed hard, knowing he spoke the truth. "Can you help us?" she asked, pride giving way to the instinct for survival, not for herself, but for her daughters. The man was silent for another long moment, his eyes moving from Elizabeth to the twins and back again. Then he nodded once, decisively. "I am 2 Bears, chief of this Cheyenne hunting party," he said, touching his chest. "You come with us. Storm too dangerous." Elizabeth Winters stood at a crossroads of fate, her daughters trembling beside her. Before her was 2 Bears, the Cheyenne chief whose hunting party had discovered them on the brink of perishing in the blizzard. His offer of help was their only chance of survival. Yet years of frontier stories and prejudice made her hesitate. At that moment, Jonathan's voice seemed to whisper in her mind, "Not all men are the same, Lizzie. Judge each by their actions, not the stories of others." "We will come with you," Elizabeth said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you." Two Bears nodded once, then spoke rapidly to his companions. One of the younger men dismounted and approached Elizabeth, gesturing to his horse. "You and small ones ride," Two Bears explained. "Storm worsens. Must move quickly." Within minutes, the Winters family had gathered their most essential belongings. Elizabeth was helped onto one pony with Hannah seated before her, while Sarah was placed on another horse with a young Cheyenne warrior who introduced himself as Running Fox. The remaining supplies were distributed among the party's pack horses. They set off into the swirling snow. Elizabeth cast one final glance at the rock face that had been their temporary shelter, wondering if she had made the right decision. The alternative, however, was certain death. The journey through the blizzard was a blur of white and cold. Elizabeth lost all sense of direction as they traveled, trusting entirely in the Cheyenne's knowledge of the land. The twins, initially frightened, grew silent and watchful, their faces partially protected from the biting wind by the blankets the warriors had provided. After what seemed like hours, the landscape began to change. The open prairie gave way to more varied terrain, hills, scattered trees, and eventually the unmistakable sound of moving water, partially frozen but still flowing beneath ice. "Medicine." "Creek!" Two Bears said, pointing to the waterway as they paralleled its course. "Camp is closed now." True to his word, they created a small rise, and Elizabeth saw smoke rising from several lodges nestled in a protected valley. The Cheyenne Winter. Camp was situated in a natural depression, sheltered by hills on three sides and bordered by the creek on the fourth. Stands of cottonwood and pine provided additional protection from the elements. As they approached, Elizabeth counted approximately 20 lodges, teepees made of buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles, their tops darkened by cook fires within. Even in the poor visibility of the storm, she could see that they were arranged in a rough circle, with larger lodges situated toward the center. Their arrival caused an immediate stir in the camp. Women emerged from teepees, children peered curiously from behind their mothers, and several men approached the returning hunting party with questioning looks. The sight of white faces among the Cheyenne riders clearly surprised them. Two Bears dismounted and addressed the gathering crowd, explaining the situation in his language. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand the words, she recognized the tone of authority and the gestures toward herself and the twins that indicated he was recounting their discovery. When he finished speaking, an elderly woman stepped forward. Her face was deeply lined, her long hair streaked with gray and wrapped in otter fur. She wore a beautifully beaded dress beneath a heavy buffalo robe, and her bearing suggested importance within the tribe. "My mother, Sage Woman," Two Bears said. "To Elizabeth, medicine woman of our people, you stay in her lodge." The elderly woman approached Elizabeth and the twins, studying them with sharp, intelligent eyes. Then, to Elizabeth's surprise, she spoke in clear, if accented English. "The children are cold. Come." Without waiting for a response, Sage Woman turned and walked toward one of the larger lodges near the center of the camp. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before following, her daughters clinging to her hands. Behind them, the warriors dispersed with their horses, Two Bears watching to ensure the white family was safely delivered to his mother's care. The interior of Sage Woman's lodge was warm and smoky, lit by the central fire and several small oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the hide walls. Colorful blankets and robes covered the ground, and various pouches, bundles of herbs, and decorative items hung from the supporting poles. The space smelled of sage, sweetgrass, and something medicinal that Elizabeth couldn't identify. "Sit," Sage Woman instructed, pointing to a pile of soft furs near the fire. Children need warmth. Elizabeth guided her daughters to the indicated spot, helping them remove their snow-crusted outer garments. The twins' faces were red from cold, their fingers and toes alarmingly pale. Sage Woman knelt beside them, examining the girls' hands and feet with gentle efficiency. She spoke a few words to a younger woman who had entered the lodge behind them, who immediately left and returned moments later with a steaming vessel. "Drink," Sage Woman said, pouring a fragrant liquid into small horn cups, cedar and cherry bark, good for the cold. Elizabeth sniffed the beverage cautiously before helping her daughters drink. The tea was bitter but not unpleasant, with hints of honey taking the edge off the medicinal taste. Almost immediately she felt warmth spreading through her body. "Thank you," she said, meeting the older woman's eyes. "We would have died out there." Sage Woman nodded matter-of-factly. "Many die in winter. Not your time." She studied Elizabeth more carefully. "You have a husband?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. "He died. Illness came to our settlement. Afterward, they forced us to leave." Sage Woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes, understanding perhaps, or the recognition of a familiar cruelty. "White people often fear what they do not understand," she said simply. "Disease comes. They look for someone to blame." The twins, warmed by the fire and tea, had begun to relax, their eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. Sarah leaned against her mother, while Hannah had already curled up on the furs, her breathing deep and regular. "Rest now," Sage Woman said, seeing Elizabeth's own fatigue. "Talk more when a storm passes." Too exhausted to protest, Elizabeth lay down beside her daughters, drawing them close under the warm buffalo robes Sage Woman provided. Despite her intention to remain vigilant in this strange place, sleep claimed her almost immediately. Elizabeth woke to unfamiliar sounds, voices speaking in a language she didn't understand, the crackle of fire, the distant nickering of horses. For a moment, disorientation gripped her before memory returned. The blizzard, the broken wagon, the Cheyenne hunting party. Sitting up, she saw that her daughters were already awake, sitting cross-legged near the fire where a young Cheyenne woman was showing them how to string colorful glass beads onto a leather thong. The girls seemed fascinated, their earlier fear apparently forgotten, in the way of children who quickly adapt to new circumstances. "Your children learn quickly," Sage Woman said from the opposite side of the lodge, where she was grinding something in a stone mortar. "The dark-haired one is Morning Bird," she added, nodding toward the young woman with the twins. "My granddaughter." "How long have we slept?" Elizabeth asked, noticing that the quality of light filtering through the smoke hole at the top of the lodge suggested it was well into the day. "One sun has passed," Sage Woman replied, "storm still blowing outside. 2 bears says the worst he has seen in many winters." Elizabeth processed this information with a mixture of relief and anxiety. The storm would prevent any immediate travel, giving them time to recover their strength, but it also meant they were committed to remaining in the Cheyenne camp for at least several days. "My son wishes to speak with you when you have eaten," Sage Woman continued, setting aside her mortar and pestle. "He has many questions." A meal of dried buffalo meat, wild turnips cooked with berries, and more of the warming tea restored Elizabeth's strength. The twins, already comfortable in their new surroundings, chattered happily with Morning Bird, who taught them simple words in the Cheyenne language, laughing at their attempts to pronounce the unfamiliar sounds. When 2 bears entered the lodge later that morning, he seemed surprised to find the white children so at ease with his niece. He watched them for a moment, his stern expression softening slightly before he turned his attention to Elizabeth. "The storm will continue for 2 more days," he said without preamble, settling cross-legged across the fire from her. "When it ends, where will you go?" The directness of the question caught Elizabeth off guard. In truth, she had no answer. The military outpost Crawford had mentioned might or might not exist, and even if it did, she had no way of knowing if they would receive help there. "I don't know," she admitted. "We were told there was a military outpost to the east, but—" "Fort Kearney?" Two Bears nodded. 3 days' ride in good weather, 6 or more in snow this deep." He studied her thoughtfully. "Why did your people send women and children into winter alone? This is not the way of honorable men." The question brought back the bitter pain of their expulsion, but Elizabeth found herself wanting this man to understand. "My husband believed your people should be treated with respect," she explained. "This made him unpopular. After he died, the settlement leader claimed we brought the sickness that killed him and others." She met Two Bears' gaze directly. "It was a lie. They wanted us gone, because we were no longer useful to them." Two Bears were silent for a long moment, absorbing her words. "I have known white men who speak with forked tongues," he said finally, "and a few who speak the truth. Your husband sounds like the second kind." "He was," Elizabeth said softly. Two Bears nodded, as if coming to a decision. "You and your children may stay until the snow melts enough for safe travel. Then we will take you to the trading post at Gray's Fork. There are good people there who can help you reach a larger settlement." The generosity of the offer stunned Elizabeth. "Why would you help us this way?" she asked. "Your people have little reason to show kindness to whites." A ghost of a smile touched Two Bears' lips. "My people judge each person by their own actions, not by the color of their skin or the actions of others who look like them." The irony of his words, so similar to what white settlers claimed about themselves but seldom practiced, was not lost on Elizabeth. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing no words could adequately express her gratitude. The next 2 weeks brought many surprises to Elizabeth Winters. As the storm finally abated and normal life resumed in the Cheyenne camp, she and her daughters were gradually integrated into daily activities. The twins adapted with the remarkable resilience of children. They quickly became favorites in the camp, their identical appearances a source of fascination among the Cheyenne, who considered twins to be spiritually significant. Sarah and Hannah absorbed Cheyenne words and customs eagerly, following mourning, bird everywhere and befriending several children their own age. For Elizabeth, the adjustment was more complex. Years of subtle prejudice did not disappear overnight, and she found herself repeatedly surprised by the sophistication of Cheyenne society. The tribe's governance, with its council of chiefs and elders who made decisions through consensus rather than decree, impressed her with its fairness. Their medical knowledge, particularly Sage Woman's extensive understanding of herbal remedies, challenged everything Elizabeth had been taught about primitive savages. Most striking was the position of women within the tribe. While different from white society, Cheyenne women wielded considerable influence. They owned the teepees and all household goods, controlled food distribution, and had strong voices in tribal matters. Elizabeth watched Sage Woman participate in council meetings with the same authority as male elders, and realized how limited her own world had been by comparison. By the 10th day, Elizabeth had established a routine. Each morning, she assisted the women in food preparation and other tasks, her carpentry-strengthened hands proving useful for heavy work. In return, they taught her their techniques for tanning hides, preserving food, and creating the intricate beadwork that decorated clothing and ceremonial items. In the evenings, the tribe often gathered for storytelling, music, or dancing. 2. Bears sometimes translated the tales for Elizabeth and her daughters, ancient legends of the Cheyenne people, their creation story, and accounts of historical events that never appeared in any white man's history book. It was during one such evening that Elizabeth noticed a change in the atmosphere of the camp. Warriors returned from scouting with serious expressions, and an urgent council meeting was called. Though not invited, Elizabeth could sense the tension that permeated the gathering. Later that night, as the twins slept soundly in the warm security of Sage Woman's lodge, Elizabeth questioned her hostess. "Something has happened, hasn't it?" Sage Woman's weathered face gave away nothing, but she nodded slightly. "Bluecoats moved north of our hunting grounds. Many soldiers. 2 bears think they are searching for a Lakota who attacked a wagon train last month." She added, "Not us, but Bluecoats see all Indians the same." The news sent a chill through Elizabeth. She knew enough about frontier conflicts to understand the danger. Military expeditions rarely differentiated between hostile and peaceful tribes. "Will your people leave?" she asked, thinking of the difficulty of moving an entire camp in deep snow. "Not yet," Sage Woman replied. 2 bears have sent riders to other camps to warn them. We wait to learn more." She looked at Elizabeth with unexpected gentleness. "Do not fear. My son is wise in the ways of the white man's army. He will not let harm come to his people, or to you and your daughters." The reassurance should have comforted Elizabeth, but instead it awoke a new concern. In the days they had spent with the Cheyenne, she had come to care deeply for these people who had shown her family such kindness. The thought of soldiers attacking the camp, perhaps because of misplaced revenge for actions of another tribe, filled her with dread. 3 days later, Elizabeth's fears materialized in the form of a Cheyenne scout who rode into camp at dawn, his pony lathered despite the cold. He spoke rapidly to 2 bears, gesturing northward with obvious urgency. The chief immediately called the council together. From the sidelines, Elizabeth watched their deliberations, understanding little of the words, but reading volumes in their expressions and body language. When the meeting concluded, 2 bears approached. "Her directly. A company of soldiers approaches from the north," he said without preamble. 40 men or more, heavily armed. They follow the trail left by our hunting party, the same trail that led us to you." Elizabeth's blood ran cold at the implication. "They're following your tracks from the storm? But that would lead them here." 2 bears confirmed grimly. "They will reach our camp by tomorrow's sunset." "What will you do?" Elizabeth asked, thinking of the women and children who would be at risk if fighting broke out. 2 bears' faces were impassive, but his eyes reflected the weight of leadership. "We cannot move the entire camp quickly enough in this snow. I have sent the youngest children and some women to a smaller camp 2 valleys away. Others prepare to defend if necessary." Elizabeth thought of the twins, playing nearby with Morning Bird, blissfully unaware of the danger. "We should leave with the others," she said. "Our presence here could make things worse when the soldiers arrive." "No," 2 bears said firmly. "You must stay." Confusion and fear flickered across Elizabeth's face. "I don't understand." "You are a white woman," 2 bears explained. "When the soldiers come, you will speak to them. Tell them you were lost in the storm, that we saved you and your children. Perhaps they will listen to one of their own kind when they would not believe a Cheyenne." Understanding dawned on Elizabeth. "You want me to be a mediator?" 2 bears nodded. "My people have done nothing wrong. We do not want war with the Bluecoats, but soldiers often shoot first and ask questions later when they see Indians." His gaze was steady, evaluating. "Will you help us, Elizabeth Winters, as we helped you?" Feshua, request and the trust it implied, humbled Elizabeth. This man was asking her to stand between his people and potential slaughter, relying on her word and her white skin to prevent bloodshed. "I will," she said with quiet determination. "I owe you and your people our lives. I will make the soldiers understand." 2 bears studied her face for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Then we prepare. I will teach you what to say and how to approach them safely." He glanced at the twins. Your daughters should remain with Sage Woman, hidden if fighting starts. That evening, as the camp made preparations for the soldiers' arrival, Elizabeth sat with her daughters in Sage Woman's lodge, struggling to explain the situation in terms they could understand. "Some soldiers are coming tomorrow," she told them. "Gently, I need to talk to them to explain that our Cheyenne friends have been kind to us. Are the soldiers bad men?" Hannah asked, her small face troubled. Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "No, they're not bad, but they might not understand that the Cheyenne are good people. They might think all Indians are dangerous because of stories they've heard." "Like Mr. Crawford thought?" Sarah asked perceptively, referring to the settlement leader who had cast them out. "Yes, something like that," Elizabeth acknowledged. "I need to help them understand the truth." "Can we help too?" Hannah asked eagerly. "We can tell them how Morning Bird taught us to make bead necklaces and how Two Bears let us ride his special horse." Elizabeth smiled despite her anxiety. "We'll see, sweetheart. For now, I need you both to promise that you'll stay with Sage Woman tomorrow and do exactly as she tells you. It's very important." The twins nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity in their mother's voice, even if they didn't fully comprehend the danger. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep, Elizabeth sat alone by the fire, her mind racing with possibilities. What if the soldiers refused to listen? What if they opened fire before she could reach them? What if her presence only confirmed their suspicions that the Cheyenne were taking white captives? She was still awake when Two Bears entered the lodge silently, moving with the natural grace that characterized all his actions. He settled across the fire from her, his face somber in the flickering light. "You should rest," he said, noting her exhaustion. "Tomorrow will require strength." "I can't stop thinking about everything that could go wrong," Elizabeth admitted. Two Bears were quiet for a moment. "Fear is like a wolf," he said finally. "Look it in the eye, and it will retreat. Turn and run, and it will chase you forever." He added, "I have faced bluecoats before. Some want only blood, but others can be reasoned with." "And if these men cannot be reasoned with?" Elizabeth asked, voicing her deepest fear. Two Bears' expressions hardened. "Then my warriors will fight to protect our people, but we will try peace first." He looked at her directly. "Your presence offers that chance." The responsibility was enormous, but Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "I won't fail you," she promised. "Your people saved my children when my own turned us away. I won't forget that." Two Bears nodded, a flicker of something like approval in his dark eyes. "Sleep now. Dawn comes quickly." As he rose to leave, Elizabeth was struck by a sudden thought. "Two Bears," she called softly. What if I could convince the soldiers that we're not just passing through your camp? What if I told them we've chosen to stay here?" The chief paused, considering her words. "You would claim to live among the Cheyenne by choice? The soldiers might think you mad, or worse, a traitor to your race." "Perhaps," Elizabeth acknowledged, "but it would be harder for them to justify an attack if they believed white women and children were living peacefully in the camp by choice." Two Bears studied her with new interest. "You would say this? If it would help protect your people, yes." A rare smile touched the chief's lips. "You have a warrior's heart, Elizabeth Winters." He thought for a moment. "We will see what kind of men these soldiers are before deciding. Sleep now. Tomorrow's path will reveal itself when we walk it." As Two Bears departed, Elizabeth finally felt calm enough to seek rest. Whatever came with the dawn, she was no longer the helpless widow cast out into the wilderness. Here, among people she had once been taught to fear, she had found not only a sanctuary but purpose. For the first time since Jonathan's death, she fell asleep with hope for the future, however uncertain that future might be. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Cheyenne camp. The normal morning activities were subdued, with warriors positioned strategically around the perimeter and women moving with purposeful efficiency as they prepared for possible evacuation. Elizabeth dressed with care in her cleanest remaining clothes, fixing her hair neatly beneath her bonnet. She wanted to appear as respectable and civilized as possible when the soldiers arrived. The twins remained with Sage Woman, who had promised to keep them safely hidden if trouble erupted. By mid-morning, scouts reported that the military patrol was approaching more rapidly than expected, likely to reach the camp by early afternoon rather than sunset. Two Bears called Elizabeth to a final council meeting to review their strategy. "You will wait here," he explained, pointing to a position just within the camp's boundary. "When the soldiers are within sight, but before they reach firing range, you will walk toward them alone, slowly, with your hands visible." Elizabeth nodded, committing the instructions to memory. "And what exactly should I tell them?" "The truth," Two Bears replied simply. "That you were cast out by your settlement, that your wagon broke in the storm, that my hunting party found you and brought you here to save your lives." He paused. "Tell them also that we plan to escort you to the trading post at Gray's Fork when the weather permits safe travel. And if they don't believe me," Two Bears' expressions were grim, "then you return to the camp immediately. My warriors will protect you after that." The implication was clear. If diplomacy failed, bloodshed would follow. Shortly after midday, the lookout gave the signal. A column of soldiers had been spotted approaching from the north, following the valley that led directly to the Cheyenne camp. Two Bears positioned his warriors out of sight, but ready to defend if necessary, while the women and remaining children gathered in the center of the camp. Elizabeth stood at the agreed position, scanning the horizon. Soon enough, she could make out the blue uniforms of the cavalry as they came into view, their horses moving steadily through the snow. She counted approximately 30 men, led by an officer whose insignia she couldn't distinguish at this distance. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Elizabeth began walking forward, away from the camp and toward the approaching soldiers. She moved deliberately, keeping her hands visible as Two Bears had instructed. The distance between them closed slowly, the soldiers continuing their advance until the officer at the front noticed her and raised his hand, halting the column. For a moment, Elizabeth and the cavalry stared at each other across 100 yards of snow-covered ground. Then the officer and two soldiers detached from the main group and rode forward to meet her. As they drew closer, Elizabeth could see that the leader was a young lieutenant, perhaps no more than 25, with a neatly trimmed beard and wary eyes. He reined in his horse about 10 yards from her, clearly surprised to encounter a white woman. "Ma'am," he called, his voice reflecting his confusion, Are you being held here against your will?" Elizabeth took another step forward, keeping her voice steady and clear. "No, Lieutenant. My name is Elizabeth Winters. My twin daughters, and I was saved by the Cheyenne after we were abandoned in the blizzard 2 weeks ago." The officer's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. "Abandoned? By whom?" "By the settlers at Crawford's Mill," Elizabeth replied. "After my husband died of illness, they forced us to leave. Our wagon broke in the storm. If the Cheyenne hunting party hadn't found us, we would have perished." The lieutenant exchanged glances with his sergeants, clearly trying to assess whether Elizabeth was speaking freely or under duress. "These Indians have been treating you well?" he asked, suggesting he was looking for any sign of coercion. "They have shown us nothing but kindness," Elizabeth said firmly. "They've fed us, sheltered us, and protected us. They plan to escort us to the trading post at Gray's Fork when the passes are clear enough for safe travel." The lieutenant's hand remained near his sidearm, his posture tense. "Ma'am, we've been tracking a band of hostiles who attacked a supply wagon last week. Trail led us this way." "Then you're following the wrong trail, Lieutenant," Elizabeth said with quiet authority. These Cheyenne have been camped here for the entire winter. Their hunting parties go out regularly, but they've committed no attacks." She met his gaze directly. "If you're looking for hostiles, you should know that the Cheyenne told me it was likely Lakota warriors who struck further north." The officer seemed taken aback by her knowledge and confidence. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "I'd like to speak with your children, ma'am, if you don't mind." Elizabeth had anticipated this request. The soldiers wanted to verify her story, to ensure she wasn't being forced to lie under threat to her children. "Of course," she replied. "They're safe in the camp. I can bring them out to meet you, or you may accompany me alone and unarmed to see them." The lieutenant's eyebrows rose at her condition. "You're rather protective of these Cheyenne. Mrs. Winters, they saved my children's lives when white Christians drove us into a blizzard," Elizabeth replied evenly. "Yes, I am protective of them." Something in her tone must have convinced him of her sincerity, for the lieutenant's posture relaxed slightly. "Very well. I'll come with you. Alone, as you say." He turned to his sergeants. "Hold the men here. No one advances without my order." Dismounting, the young officer approached Elizabeth on foot, removing his gloves to show he carried no weapon. "Lieutenant Michael Harrington, 7th Cavalry." He introduced himself properly. "This way, Lieutenant Harrington," Elizabeth said, turning back toward the camp where she knew 2 bears would be watching every move. As they walked, Elizabeth felt the weight of many lives resting on her shoulders. Everything now depended on what Lieutenant Harrington saw in the Cheyenne camp and what he chose to believe. As Elizabeth led Lieutenant Harrington toward the Cheyenne camp, she could feel the eyes of hidden warriors tracking their every move. Though 2 bears had agreed to this meeting, she knew that one wrong move by the young officer could trigger a deadly confrontation. "Mrs. Winters," Lieutenant Harrington said quietly as they walked, "I must warn you that if these Cheyenne are holding other white captives, or if we find evidence of the attack on our supply wagon, I will have no choice but to take action." Elizabeth matched his direct tone. "You'll find no captives, Lieutenant. Only my daughters and myself, guests of the Cheyenne by choice rather than force." As they approached the camp's edge, 2 bears emerged from between 2 lodges, standing tall and proud in full ceremonial dress. A calculated decision that Elizabeth understood immediately. By presenting himself in traditional regalia rather than war paint, the chief was signaling his willingness to meet peacefully while simultaneously asserting his position of authority. Lieutenant Harrington tensed visibly, but maintained his composure. Elizabeth watched the 2 men evaluate each other with the wariness of natural adversaries forced into proximity. "This is 2 bears," she said, "chief of this band and the man whose hunting party saved our lives." 2 bears extended his hand in the white man's custom, another deliberate choice. After a moment's hesitation, Lieutenant Harrington accepted. "The handshake. Your woman speaks good words about Cheyenne," 2 bears said in his accented English. "We are not a war party. We are a winter camp. Families, children." The lieutenant nodded stiffly. "I understand you helped Mrs. Winters and her daughters. That was commendable." 2 bears' expressions remained impassive. "White settlers drove them to die in snow. Cheyenne gave life instead, which acts like true Christians." The pointed question clearly made Harrington uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and redirected. "Mrs. Winters mentioned her daughters. I'd like to speak with them, if I may." "This way," Elizabeth said, guiding him towards Sage Woman's Lodge. As they moved through the camp, Elizabeth was acutely aware of how the scene would appear to military eyes. The Cheyenne had deliberately arranged for Harrington to see women cooking, children playing, and elders sitting by fires. The normal activities of a peaceful settlement rather than a war party. Still, warriors stood at strategic points throughout. The camp, their presence neither hidden nor emphasized. Outside Sage Woman's Lodge, Elizabeth paused. "My daughters are inside with Sage Woman, 2 bears' mother. They've grown quite attached to her over these past weeks." The lieutenant nodded his understanding, and Elizabeth called softly into the teepee. A moment later, the twins emerged, followed by the elderly medicine woman. Sarah and Hannah blinked in the bright sunlight, their eyes widening at the sight of the uniformed stranger. They wore their own clothes, but had small beaded decorations in their hair, gifts from Morning Bird that they treasured. "Girls," Elizabeth said gently, "this is Lieutenant Harrington. He'd like to speak with you." The twins exchanged identical glances of uncertainty before Sarah, always the bolder of the two, stepped forward. "Are you a real soldier, sir?" Lieutenant Harrington's stern expression softened slightly. "Yes, I am. I command a company of the 7th Cavalry." "Do you have a horse?" Hannah asked, finding her courage. "Two Bears let us ride his special pony yesterday. He said we did very well." Elizabeth watched the lieutenant's face as her daughters chattered enthusiastically about their experiences in the Cheyenne camp. The friends they'd made, the beadwork they were learning, how Morning Bird was teaching them Cheyenne words. There was no mistaking the genuine affection in their voices or their lack of fear. After several minutes, Harrington gently interrupted. "You seem very happy here." "We are," Sarah confirmed. "But Mama says when the snow melts, we'll go to another place where there are white people who will be kind to us, not like Mr. Crawford and the others who made us leave in the snow." The mention of their abandonment brought a dark look to the lieutenant's face. "Crawford's mill, you said?" he asked Elizabeth. "Sherman Crawford?" Elizabeth nodded. "Do you know of him?" "The Army has had dealings with Crawford before," Harrington said carefully. "There have been complaints about his treatment of both Indians and settlers who don't share his views." This revelation surprised Elizabeth. She had assumed Crawford's cruelty was known only to those who experienced it directly. Harrington turned back to the twins. "Thank you, girls. You've been very helpful." As the children returned to the lodge with Sage Woman, the lieutenant's demeanor shifted subtly. Whatever doubts he might have harbored about Elizabeth's story seemed to have diminished in the face of the twins' artless testimony. "I need to inspect your camp," he said to Two Bears, who had observed the exchange silently. "You may walk with me," the chief agreed, "but your soldiers stay outside." Harrington hesitated, then nodded. "I'll need to report back to my men first. They'll be getting restless." Lieutenant Harrington stood before his mounted troops, Elizabeth and Two Bears, waiting several yards behind him. "The situation is not as reported," he informed his sergeants. "There are no hostiles or captives here, only a peaceful winter camp. Mrs. Winters and her daughters are here of their own free will after being rescued during the blizzard." "Sir," one sergeant objected, "our orders were to investigate all Indian encampments along this route. Command believes the raiders came this way." "I'm conducting a thorough inspection now," Harrington replied firmly. "The rest of you will maintain your position here. Sergeant Miller, you'll accompany me." Elizabeth felt a surge of hope as she watched the exchange. The lieutenant's words suggested he was inclined to believe their account, though clearly he still needed to fulfill his military obligations. The inspection of the camp proceeded methodically. Lieutenant Harrington and his sergeant examined the teepees, the horse herd, and the weapons carried by Cheyenne warriors. Two Bears permitted this with dignified cooperation, answering questions directly and allowing access to all areas of the camp, except the sacred lodge where spiritual items were kept. Throughout the process, Elizabeth remained close, occasionally clarifying translations or providing context. She noticed Harrington's professional demeanor gradually giving way to genuine curiosity as he observed aspects of Cheyenne life that contradicted common stereotypes. When they reached the area where hunting trophies and horse equipment were stored, the lieutenant paused, examining several sets of tracks preserved in a sheltered area. "These ponies are unshod," he noted, pointing to hoofprints in the dirt. "The raiders who attacked our supply wagon rode shod horses, army mounts, most. likely stolen in previous raids. Two Bears nodded. Lakota war parties to the north took many horses from Bluecoats last summer, not Cheyenne horses. The distinction might seem minor to an untrained observer, but Elizabeth recognized its significance. The lieutenant was finding evidence that supported Two Bears' claims of innocence. By late afternoon, the inspection was complete. Lieutenant Harrington conferred briefly with his sergeant before addressing Two Bears and Elizabeth together. I find no evidence connecting your people to the attack on our supply wagon, he stated officially. Based on the tracks and your account of Lakota activity to the north, I believe our investigation should be redirected in that direction. Relief washed over Elizabeth. Two Bears maintained his stoic expression, but she detected the slight relaxation of his shoulders, the only indication of the tension he had been carrying. However, Harrington continued, I cannot simply leave white civilians in an Indian camp, regardless of the circumstances. My orders require me to escort any white settlers to the nearest safe outpost. Before Elizabeth could protest, Two Bears spoke. Elizabeth Winters and her small ones are under Cheyenne protection. They go when snow melts and trails are safe, when they choose. The two men locked eyes in silent challenge, the fragile peace suddenly threatened by this fundamental disagreement. Elizabeth stepped forward. Lieutenant Harrington, I appreciate your concern for our welfare. But Two Bears is right. The journey would be dangerous for my daughters in these conditions. She paused, weighing her next words carefully. Perhaps there's another solution that would satisfy your obligations without forcing us to leave. Immediately, Harrington raised an eyebrow. I'm listening, Mrs. Winters. Write in your report that you found us safe and well treated, and that we've chosen to remain under Cheyenne protection until better traveling conditions prevail. She added strategically, you could also mention that Two Bears has agreed to escort us to Gray's Fork trading post when the time comes, not as captives being released, but as guests being assisted on their journey. The lieutenant considered. Her suggestion, clearly torn between strict adherence to his orders and the obvious truth of the situation before him. I could also remain here to monitor the situation, he said slowly. Not the entire company. That would strain the camp's resources, just myself and perhaps two men as observers. Two Bears' eyes narrowed slightly at this compromise, but Elizabeth recognized the wisdom in it. The lieutenant could fulfill his duty to ensure their safety while simultaneously gathering first-hand knowledge of Cheyenne life that might challenge the Army's prejudices. That seems reasonable, she said before Two Bears could object. Doesn't it, Chief? After a long moment, Two Bears gave a single nod. 3 Bluecoats may stay. As guests, not guards. They will learn Cheyenne ways. Lieutenant Harrington seemed slightly taken aback by this reframing of his suggestion, but he accepted it with a crisp nod. I'll arrange it immediately. 2 days later, the Cheyenne camp had adjusted to the presence of Lieutenant Harrington and 2 of his men, Corporal James Wilson, a young recruit from Ohio, and Private Thomas Jenkins, an older soldier with experience as a frontier scout. The rest of the cavalry company had departed to continue their search for the actual raiders to the north, with orders to return in 2 weeks' time. The arrangement was awkward at first. The soldiers maintained military discipline, keeping to themselves and conducting regular perimeter checks as if expecting an attack at any moment. The Cheyenne warriors watched them warily, particularly the younger men who had less experience with white people. It was Elizabeth who gradually bridged this divide, using her unique position as intermediary to create opportunities for interaction. She invited Lieutenant Harrington to join her family for meals in Sage Woman's Lodge, where the elderly medicine woman's dignity and wisdom clearly impressed the young officer. She encouraged the twins to show Corporal Wilson their beadwork, drawing the Sky Soldier into conversation about his own family back east. Most surprisingly effective was Private Jenkins, whose years on the frontier had taught him to respect native skills. Within days, he was accompanying Cheyenne hunters, exchanging techniques and stories with growing camaraderie. One evening, as Elizabeth sat outside Sage Woman's lodge, enjoying a rare moment of solitude, Lieutenant Harrington approached and settled beside her. "Your daughters seem completely at home here," he observed, watching the twins play a Cheyenne children's game with several other children nearby. "Children adapt quickly," Elizabeth replied. "They accept people as they are, without the prejudices we adults carry." Harrington was quiet for a moment. "I was raised to believe that Indians, all Indians, were savages incapable of true civilization." He gestured toward the well-organized camp. The families gathered around fires, the council of elders discussing tribal matters. "Clearly, I was misinformed." "Most settlers are," Elizabeth said gently. "We're taught to fear what we don't understand, and few take the time to understand the native peoples whose lands we've claimed. Your husband was different, I gather." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "Jonathan believed in judging people by their actions, not by stories told about them. It made him unpopular in settlements like Crawford's Mill, where fear breeds hatred, and led to your expulsion," Harrington concluded. He hesitated before adding, "I've sent a rider to Fort Laramie with a report on Crawford's actions. Abandoning women and children in winter violates territorial law. He will face consequences." The news stirred complicated feelings in Elizabeth. She had no desire to return to Crawford's Mill, but the thought of justice being served offered some closure. "What will happen when the snow melts?" Harrington asked after a while. "Will you truly go to Gray's Fork?" Elizabeth gazed across the camp, watching two bears instructing young warriors, Sage Woman treating a child's cough, Morning Bird laughing as she worked on a ceremonial dress. In the weeks since their rescue, this place had become more of a home than Crawford's Mill ever was. "I don't know," she admitted. "Gray's Fork would be the practical choice. I could find work there, perhaps teaching. My daughters would grow up among other white children," she sighed. "But they would also grow up hearing the same prejudices that led to our abandonment. Is that what I want for them?" Harrington looked surprised. "You're considering staying with the Cheyenne permanently?" "The thought has crossed my mind," Elizabeth acknowledged. "They've shown us more Christian charity than those who claim to be Christians. My daughters are happy here. They're learning 2 languages, 2 ways of seeing the world." "It would be an unusual choice," the lieutenant said carefully. "These are unusual circumstances," Elizabeth replied, "and times are changing. The old divisions between native and settler may not always be as rigid as they are now." Their conversation was interrupted by 2 bears who approached with his characteristic quiet dignity. "Council fire burns tonight," he announced. "Elders wish the lieutenant to speak, tell about the soldier chief's plans for Cheyenne lands." Harrington looked startled by the invitation, unprecedented in his experience with native tribes. "I would be honored," he said after a moment's hesitation, as the lieutenant departed to prepare for this unexpected diplomatic opportunity. 2 bears remained, his dark eyes studying Elizabeth thoughtfully. "You speak well with the Blue-Coat Chief," he observed. "He listens to your words." "He's a good man trying to do his duty," Elizabeth replied. "And he's beginning to see your people as they truly are, not as he was taught to see them." 2 bears nodded slowly. "This is good medicine. When white soldiers see the truth with their own eyes, maybe fewer Cheyenne die." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "My mother says you and small ones need not leave when snow melts. Cheyenne people would welcome you to stay." The offer, though not entirely unexpected given her conversation with Sage Woman days earlier, still took Elizabeth's breath away. "Would you accept us as part of your tribe, even though we're white? Color of skin matters less than content of heart," Two Bears replied simply, "You have shown courage and wisdom. Your small ones bring joy to our camp. Why should you not stay if that is your wish?" Before Elizabeth could respond, Sarah and Hannah came running up, breathless with excitement. "Mama!" Morning Bird says there's going to be a special council tonight and we can watch if we're very quiet, Sarah exclaimed. "And Lieutenant Harrington is going to speak to everyone," Hannah added. "Is it true?" Elizabeth smiled at their enthusiasm. "Yes, it's true. Now go help Sage Woman prepare for the evening meal. I'll be there shortly." As the twins raced off, Elizabeth turned back to Two Bears. "Thank you for the offer. I need time to consider what's best for my daughters." The chief inclined his head. "Time is a gift the Creator gives freely. Use it wisely." With that, he departed to oversee preparations for the council meeting. Left alone with her thoughts, Elizabeth gazed across the camp that had been their sanctuary these past weeks. The decision before her was momentous, not just for herself, but for Sarah and Hannah's future. To choose permanent life among the Cheyenne would mean embracing a world entirely different from the one she had known, with its own challenges and prejudices from both sides. Yet something in her heart had shifted during their time here. The tight boundary between us and them that defined frontier thinking had dissolved in the face of simple human kindness. She had glimpsed a way of life that honored the wisdom of elders, the strength of women, and the sacredness of the natural world, values that resonated deeply with her own beliefs. That evening, the council fire burned bright in the center of the camp. The Cheyenne elders sat in their place of honor, with Two Bears among them as head chief. Lieutenant Harrington and his men were given respected positions in the circle, while Elizabeth and her daughters sat with Sage Woman and the other women of importance. What unfolded was an exchange unlike any Elizabeth had witnessed before. Honest discussion between representatives of two worlds, often locked in conflict. Harrington spoke of army orders and settlement pressures, but also of his personal desire to avoid bloodshed. The Cheyenne elders shared their concerns about broken treaties and diminishing hunting grounds, but also their hope for peaceful coexistence. No solutions were reached that night, no promises made beyond those already established, but Elizabeth saw something rare and precious taking shape. The beginning of understanding between people separated by culture, but united by their shared humanity. As the council concluded and families returned to their lodges, Elizabeth found herself walking beside Lieutenant Harrington. "I've never experienced anything like that," he admitted quietly. "In all my training, Indians were presented as either hostile to be engaged or wards to be managed, never as equals in discussion." "Perhaps that's the problem," Elizabeth suggested. "We've never truly listened to them as we would expect to be heard ourselves." Harrington nodded thoughtfully. "My report to command will reflect what I've witnessed here. It may not change policy immediately, but it's a start." "A start is all we can hope for," Elizabeth agreed. "Change comes slowly, but it does come." As they reached Sage Woman's lodge, where the twins had already been settled for the night, Harrington paused. "Have you decided about staying?" Elizabeth gazed up at the stars scattered across the vast prairie sky. "Not yet, but I'm beginning to believe there might be a place for us here. Not as white people living among Indians, but as people finding a new way to belong." The lieutenant was silent for a long moment. "Whatever you decide, Mrs. Winters, I believe you and your daughters will be pioneers of a sort, building bridges where others have only seen barriers." With those words, he bid her good night and returned to the small tent he shared with his men at the edge of the camp. Elizabeth entered the lodge quietly, finding her daughters already asleep, their faces peaceful in the dying firelight. Sage Woman sat nearby, her gnarled hands working smoothly on a small beaded pouch. "The Bluecoat Chief speaks well for a young man," the elderly woman observed, without looking up from her work. He has eyes that see and ears that hear. Yes, Elizabeth agreed, settling beside her. He's different from what I expected. Sage. Women's weathered face creased in a smile. Many things are different from what we expect when we open our hearts to see truly. She set aside her beadwork. My son has told you of our wish for you to stay. Elizabeth nodded. It's a generous offer, more than I could have imagined when we were cast out of Crawford's Mill. The Great Spirit works in ways we cannot see, Sage Woman said simply. Sometimes bad medicine becomes good medicine through unexpected paths. She looked directly at Elizabeth. You have healed old wounds by bringing the Blue Coat Chief to sit at our council. Perhaps this is why you were sent to us. The thought was both humbling and overwhelming that their desperate plight might serve some greater purpose of reconciliation. Elizabeth wasn't sure she believed in such divine orchestration, yet she couldn't deny the extraordinary convergence of circumstances that had brought them to this moment. I don't know if we're meant to stay permanently, Elizabeth said honestly. But I do know that whatever path we choose, my daughters and I will carry the wisdom of the Cheyenne with us, and we will tell the truth about your people to any who will listen. Sage Woman nodded, satisfied. This is good. Truth is strong medicine. She rose stiffly. Sleep now. Tomorrow brings new light. As Elizabeth prepared for sleep beside her daughters, her mind continued to wrestle with the choice before her. Stay with the Cheyenne who had saved them, embracing a new identity that crossed the rigid boundaries of frontier society, or return to the white world, carrying their experience as a testament to the possibility of understanding across cultures. Both paths held promise and peril. Both would require courage and conviction. What seemed clearest as sleep finally claimed her was that the cruel expulsion from Crawford's Mill, intended as a death sentence, had instead opened a door to unexpected salvation. Not just physical rescue from the blizzard, but spiritual awakening to a broader vision of humanity. Whatever Elizabeth decided for their future, that gift of perspective would remain. Morning dawned clear and cold, the camp already stirring with activity when Elizabeth woke. The twins had risen early, eager to join Morningbird for their daily lessons in Cheyenne language and crafts. As Elizabeth emerged from the lodge, she noticed unusual movement at the camp's perimeter. Warriors were gathering, some on horseback, others checking weapons. Two bears stood with Lieutenant Harrington, both men looking grave as they studied something on the ground between them. Concerned, Elizabeth approached, the lieutenant acknowledging her with a nod. "Mrs. Winters," he said formally, "we have a situation developing that you should be aware of." "What's happened?" she asked, noting the tension in both men's postures. Two bears pointed to tracks in the snow just beyond the camp boundary. "Riders, whom came at night, watching camp, not Cheyenne. Scouts found signs of a larger party about 3 miles north," Harrington added. "Based on their pattern of movement, I believe it's the Lakota war party we've been tracking." His expression hardened, and they appeared to be preparing for an attack. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "An attack? In the camp?" Two bears nodded grimly. "Lakota see bluecoats here, think Cheyenne now ally with white soldiers, makes us enemies in their eyes. We need to evacuate the women and children immediately," Harrington said urgently. "Including you and your daughters, Mrs. Winters. My men and I will help provide defense while—" "No," Two Bears interrupted firmly. "This is Cheyenne camp. We defend our own." "With all due respect, Chief," Harrington countered, "you're outnumbered. My reports indicate at least 30 warriors in this war party. You have perhaps 18 men of fighting age. And now 3 more," came Private Jenkins' voice as he and Corporal Wilson approached, rifles in hand. "Begging your pardon, Lieutenant, but we can't in good conscience ride out and leave these people to face that war party alone. Not after their hospitality." Elizabeth watched the lieutenant's face as he processed this unexpected declaration of loyalty from his men. The military protocol he had been trained to follow was clearly at odds with the human bonds that had formed during their stay. After a long moment, Harrington straightened his shoulders. "You're right, Private. We stand with our hosts." He turned to Two Bears. "If you'll accept our assistance, we'll fight alongside your warriors." The chief studied the lieutenant's face, perhaps searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he extended his hand. "Cheyenne and Bluecoat stand together. This is new medicine, powerful." As the men began discussing defense strategies, Elizabeth's mind raced. The twins were still with Morningbird, blissfully unaware of the danger approaching. She needed to find them to ensure they would be safe if fighting erupted. But as she turned to go, a new thought struck her, one so unexpected yet so obvious that she paused mid-step. "Wait," she called to the men. "Before you prepare for battle, consider another possibility." Two Bears and Harrington both turned to her with questioning looks. "The Lakota believe you're enemies because they see soldiers in a Cheyenne camp," Elizabeth said slowly. "What if we show them something they don't expect, something that might make them reconsider their assumptions?" "What do you propose, Mrs. Winters?" Harrington asked. Elizabeth took a deep breath. "A meeting, not between warriors ready for battle, but between chiefs seeking understanding. Lieutenant Harrington representing the U.S. Army, Two Bears representing the Cheyenne, and whoever leads the Lakota war party." The men exchanged skeptical glances. "Lakota warriors come for battle, not words," Two Bears said doubtfully. "True," Elizabeth acknowledged, "but they also value courage and honor. If you ride out together, just the two of you, under a flag of truce, it will either impress them with your bravery or at least make them curious enough to listen." Harrington frowned. "It's an enormous risk. If they don't respect the truce..." The council began with ceremonial pipe smoking and formal speeches in multiple languages. Two Bears and Spotted Eagle each recounted their understanding of recent conflicts, their words translated for all to understand. Lieutenant Harrington, in a move that clearly surprised some present, spoke candidly about military orders and settler pressures, neither defending nor condemning, but offering context. As the night deepened, discussion turned to practical matters: hunting territories, military patrols, communication protocols that might prevent future misunderstandings. No formal treaty could be made without government representatives, but the foundations for a new understanding were being laid around this fire. Elizabeth watched in wonder, her daughters drowsing against her as the hours passed. What had begun as a desperate gamble had transformed into something profound, perhaps not lasting peace, but a moment of genuine dialogue between enemies who had discovered they shared more common ground than expected. When the council finally concluded near midnight, Lieutenant Harrington sought Elizabeth out as the camp settled for sleep. "Your daughter's courage changed everything today," he said quietly. "Without them, we would likely be counting our dead instead of discussing hunting boundaries." "They were just being themselves," Elizabeth replied. "Children who've learned to see people as individuals rather than as white or Indian." Harrington was silent for a moment, staring into the dying council fire. "Mrs. Winters, when my company returns next week, I'll be expected to make a full report of everything that's happened here." He looked at her directly. "Including your situation and that of your daughters." Elizabeth felt a flicker of apprehension. "And what will you report?" "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you've decided. Will you go to Gray's Fork when the snow melts, or..." He left the alternative unspoken. It was the question Elizabeth had been contemplating since Two Bears had extended his invitation for them to remain with the Cheyenne permanently. After today's events, the choice seemed simultaneously clearer and more complex. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Part of me feels we belong here now. The twins are flourishing, learning two languages, two ways of seeing the world. But another part wonders if we would eventually be caught between worlds." "Never fully belonging to either," Harrington nodded in understanding. "For what it's worth, I believe you and your daughters have found a unique place for yourselves here, not as outsiders or guests, but as bridge builders." He hesitated before adding, "That said, if you did choose to return to white society, I would ensure you received proper assistance. My family in St. Louis would gladly help you establish yourselves there." The offer was generous and unexpected. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll consider it alongside our other options." As Harrington departed, Elizabeth gazed around the now quiet camp. Spotted Eagle and his warriors had established their own campsite. Nearby, not fully integrated but no longer positioned for attack. Throughout both camps, people slept peacefully, who might otherwise have died violently, but for the courage of two small girls and the willingness of proud men to listen. It struck Elizabeth that perhaps their purpose here wasn't finished. Perhaps. The twins' medicine, their unique ability to bridge cultural divides, was needed now more than ever. The thought was both daunting and exhilarating. Over the next several days, an unusual harmony prevailed between the Cheyenne camp, the Lakota visitors, and the cavalry soldiers. Children played together despite language barriers, women exchanged techniques for beadwork and food preparation, and men who might have killed each other shared hunting strategies and stories. Elizabeth observed these interactions with growing certainty that she was witnessing something rare and precious, a glimpse of what might be possible if understanding replaced fear on the frontier. The twins thrived in this environment, moving easily between cultural worlds with the adaptability of childhood. They learned Lakota words to add to their growing Cheyenne vocabulary, proudly showed their beadwork to Lieutenant Harrington, and told Spotted Eagle stories from their father's Bible in exchange for Lakota legends. One evening, as Elizabeth watched, her daughters demonstrating a Cheyenne children's game to the lieutenant's men, Sage Woman settled beside her. "Your heart has found its answer," the elderly medicine woman observed. "I see it in your eyes." Elizabeth smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "To one who knows how to look." Sage Woman's weathered hand covered Elizabeth's. "The small ones have shown the way, as children often do. Their path lies between worlds, building bridges where others see only walls." "It won't be easy," Elizabeth acknowledged. "Neither white society nor native tribes typically accept those who live between cultures. All new trails are difficult at first," Sage Woman replied with the wisdom of her years. "But those who walk them make the way easier for others who follow." The next morning, Elizabeth sought out Two Bears. She found him by the creek, contemplating the flowing water that had begun to emerge from beneath winter ice, a sign of the approaching spring thaw. "I've made my decision," she told him without a preamble. "The twins and I will stay with the Cheyenne through the spring and summer." Two Bears nodded, unsurprised. "And after summer, we'll travel with Lieutenant Harrington to the fort, and from there to St. Louis," Elizabeth continued. "The girls need education in both worlds if they're to truly bridge them. We'll spend winters in the city, learning white ways, and return to your people each spring to learn Cheyenne wisdom." It was an unprecedented arrangement, yet somehow fitting for their unprecedented situation. Two Bears considered her words carefully before responding. "This is good medicine," he said finally. "The small ones will grow strong in mind and spirit, carrying knowledge between our peoples." He looked at her directly. "And their mother, will her heart be divided between these worlds?" Elizabeth gazed across the camp that had become her sanctuary. "My heart has found room for both," she answered, honestly. Jonathan would have wanted this for us, to help build understanding where there has been only fear. Two Bears smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his stern features. Then it is decided. You and small ones will be Cheyenne. When with us, carrying our stories to the white world when you go, and when you return each spring, you will bring white knowledge to share with us. The arrangement was formalized that evening, in a special ceremony combining elements of both cultures. Elizabeth and the twins stood before the combined councils of Cheyenne and Lakota, with Lieutenant Harrington and his men as witnesses. Sage woman wrapped them in a beautifully beaded buffalo robe, symbolizing Cheyenne protection, while Two Bears bestowed new names reflecting their unique status. The twins became Sunrise Sisters, a reference to their role in bringing new light to old conflicts. Elizabeth was named Bridge Builder, acknowledging her vision of creating understanding between divided peoples. As the ceremony concluded with songs and prayers in multiple languages, Elizabeth felt Jonathan's presence strongly. He had died, believing in the possibility of respect between cultures. Now, through a series of events both tragic and miraculous, his family had become living embodiments of that belief. When the cavalry company returned the following week, they found an unexpected scene. Cheyenne and Lakota camps peacefully coexisting, with Lieutenant Harrington and his men fully integrated into daily activities. The company captain was initially skeptical, but Harrington's detailed report, supported by the evidence before him, gradually convinced him of the unusual alliance that had formed. The presence of Elizabeth and her daughters, particularly the twins' easy movement between cultural groups, provided compelling proof that coexistence was possible. After much discussion, the captain agreed to include Lieutenant Harrington's recommendations. In his report to command, formal recognition of Cheyenne and Lakota hunting territories, regular diplomatic meetings between tribal leaders and military representatives, and acknowledgement of the need for better enforcement of existing treaties. Whether these recommendations would be accepted remained to be seen, but the seeds of a different approach had been planted, seeds that might, with proper nurturing, grow into genuine understanding. As spring fully arrived, bringing purple, crocuses pushing through melting snow, and the return of birds from southern wintering grounds, Elizabeth watched her daughters practicing archery with Cheyenne children. Their laughter rang clear in the warming air, their confidence and joy evidence of their remarkable resilience. From cast-out settlers facing certain death to bridge builders between worlds, their journey had been extraordinary by any measure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Elizabeth knew they would face them with the strength they had found here, among people who had once been strangers, but now were family of the heart. The cruelty of Crawford's Mill had been meant as their end. Instead, it had become their beginning, the first step on a path none of them could have imagined, but all now embraced with hope and determination. In the years that followed, the story of the widow and her twin daughters became legend on the frontier, a tale told around campfires and in settlement schoolrooms alike. Some versions emphasized the Cheyenne rescue, others the twins' role in preventing battle between enemies. All recognized the power of unexpected kindness to transform lives and challenge boundaries. As for Elizabeth Winters and her daughters, they kept their unusual promise. Winters spent in St. Louis, where the girls received formal education, and Elizabeth worked as a teacher specializing in frontier relations. Summers with the Cheyenne, where they absorbed traditional knowledge and helped document a way of life under increasing threat. The bridges they built were small in the grand scheme of American expansion, but for those whose lives they touched. Cheyenne children who learned to read English, white students who heard authentic native stories, military officers who gained cultural understanding. These bridges made all the difference, and it had begun with a simple act of compassion, a Cheyenne chief who chose to save rather than ignore three white figures struggling in a blizzard, cast out by their own kind, but destined to create connections across the divided worlds of the American frontier. The steamboat churned steadily upstream against the Missouri River's current, its paddle wheel throwing glittering spray into the morning sunlight. On the upper deck, a woman in her early 40s stood watching the landscape pass, her auburn hair now threaded with silver, but her posture still straight and strong. Elizabeth Winters had made this journey many times over the past decade, yet the anticipation never diminished. "Mother, there it is!" Elizabeth turned as two young women joined her at the railing. At 17, Sarah and Hannah Winters had grown into remarkable young adults, their identical features maturing into a striking beauty that combined their father's strength and their mother's grace. They were dressed in practical traveling clothes, their strawberry blonde hair braided simply for the journey, but each wore distinctive beaded necklaces of Cheyenne design, gifts from Sage Woman on their 16th birthday. Following their pointing fingers, Elizabeth spotted the familiar trading post that marked the beginning of their annual summer journey. Gray's Fork had grown substantially from the simple outpost it had been when they first passed through 10 years ago. Now it boasted a proper dock, several substantial buildings, and a steady flow of traffic between the settled territories and the ever-shrinking frontier. "Do you think Two Bears received our message?" Hannah asked, scanning the shore for familiar faces. "What if something's changed since last summer?" Elizabeth squeezed her daughter's hand reassuringly. "He'll be there. Two Bears has never broken his word to us." Indeed, as the steamboat docked and passengers disembarked, Elizabeth spotted the distinctive figure waiting patiently apart from the crowd. Two Bears, now in his 50s, but still standing with the dignity that had impressed her from their first meeting. Beside him was a younger man Elizabeth recognized as Swift Hawk, his son, who had been just a boy when the Winters family first joined the Cheyenne camp. "Grandmother sends greetings," Two Bears said after formal welcomes were exchanged. His English had improved over the years, though he still preferred his native tongue for important matters. "She is eager to see how the Sunrise Sisters have grown." The twins beamed at the mention of their Cheyenne name and the reference to Sage Woman, now in her 90s, but still the spiritual heart of the tribe. "We've brought her the medicines she requested from St. Louis," Sarah said, patting one of their trunks, "and the special tea for her arthritis." As Swifthawk loaded their belongings onto the wagon that would take them to the Cheyenne summer camp, Elizabeth took in the changes around them. Gray's Fork had become a true settlement, with a school, church, and various businesses. She recognized the schoolhouse she had helped establish 7 years earlier, where during winter visits she taught classes that included both settler and native children, a rarity on the frontier, but a growing success under her guidance. "There are more soldiers at the fort," Two Bears observed as they left the trading post behind, "but Captain Harrington keeps them respectful of our boundaries." Elizabeth smiled at the mention of their old ally. Michael Harrington, promoted to captain years ago, had maintained his unusual commitment to peaceful relations with the Cheyenne and Lakota in his jurisdiction. His career advancement had been slowed by his unorthodox approach, but his results, fewer conflicts, more stable settlements, and increasingly productive trade, had eventually earned him recognition from more progressive elements in the military command. "We have letters for him from his family in St. Louis," Hannah mentioned. "His daughter Mary is considering attending the same women's college where Sarah and I have been accepted." This casual reference to their education would have been unthinkable for native women, and unlikely even for frontier girls just a decade earlier. Yet it perfectly exemplified the unique path the twins had forged, excelling in formal studies during their winters in St. Louis, while maintaining deep connections to Cheyenne traditions during their summers. As they created a familiar rise, the Cheyenne summer camp came into view in the valley below, Elizabeth felt the familiar tug of homecoming at the sight. Though significantly smaller than it had been 10 years ago, government policies had forced many families onto distant reservations. The heart of the community remained intact. The camp had evolved over the years. While traditional teepees still dominated, several permanent wooden structures now stood among them. A meeting hall, built with Jonathan's carpentry tools that Elizabeth had preserved, a small schoolhouse for winter use, and a medicine lodge, where sage women trained younger healers in traditional practices. Their arrival caused the usual stir of excitement. Children ran to greet the wagon, dogs barking alongside them. The twins jumped down before the wagon fully stopped, immediately surrounded by friends they had known since childhood. Despite months of separation each year, these bonds remained unbroken, another testament to the bridge they had built between worlds. Elizabeth descended more carefully, scanning the welcoming faces for one in particular. She found her near the center of camp. Sage woman, now so ancient that she rarely walked without assistance, seated regally before her lodge. The years had bent her body, but had done nothing to diminish the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes. Making her way through the crowd, Elizabeth knelt before the elderly medicine woman and took her gnarled hands gently. "We have returned as promised, Mother," she said in Cheyenne, using the term of respect sage woman had bestowed upon her years ago. The old woman's face creased in a smile. "Bridge builder comes back with the spring flowers, as always." She peered past Elizabeth to where the twins were already deep in conversation with their Cheyenne age mates. The Sunrise sisters grow taller each year. Soon they will walk their own paths. The observation carried weight beyond simple commentary on the twins' maturity. At 17, Sarah and Hannah stood at the threshold of adulthood, their future directions still forming. Would they continue the pattern their mother had established, dividing their lives between two worlds? Or would they choose one path over the other? "They speak of teaching," Elizabeth shared as she helped Sage Woman to a more comfortable position. "Sarah with children, Hannah with plants and healing. They want to bring knowledge between our peoples, as we have done." Sage Woman nodded approvingly. "The trail you made is well worn now. Others follow where you first walked alone." This was true in ways Elizabeth could never have imagined when they first made their unusual arrangement. What had begun as a personal solution for her family had gradually expanded into something larger, an unofficial exchange of knowledge and traditions that benefited both communities. Each summer, the Winter's women brought medicines, books, and news from the East. During their stay, Elizabeth documented Cheyenne stories and traditions in writing, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost as the old ways faced increasing pressure. The twins studied plant medicine with Sage Woman and tribal history with the elders, knowledge they would later share with carefully selected scholars in St. Louis. In winter, when they returned to the city, their home became a gathering place for those interested in genuine understanding of native cultures. Elizabeth's position as a teacher at a progressive women's school allowed her to influence future educators. The twins' unusual upbringing made them natural cultural interpreters, respected in both worlds despite the prejudices that still dominated. Frontier thinking. That evening, as was tradition on their first night back in camp, a council fire was lit. The entire community gathered to exchange news and renew connections. Two Bears and other tribal leaders spoke of the challenges facing the Cheyenne, continued pressure to cede lands, declining buffalo herds, and the ever-present threat of forced relocation to distant reservations. When it was Elizabeth's turn to speak, she shared news from the eastern cities and settlements, political developments, changing attitudes, and the growing, if still small, movement advocating for fair treatment of native peoples. "There are more voices speaking for justice now," she told the council in fluent Cheyenne. Books have been published telling true stories of the people, not just the tales of savagery that settlers learn. Schools are beginning to teach that native ways have value and wisdom. She did not exaggerate the progress. The dominant attitude among white Americans remained one of superiority and manifest destiny. Yet the seeds of change were being planted, and Elizabeth took quiet pride in knowing her family had contributed to that planting. After the formal council concluded, smaller conversations continued around the fire. Elizabeth found herself sitting with Captain Harrington, who had ridden from the fort upon hearing of their arrival. Now in his mid-30s, his once youthful face had weathered into that of a seasoned officer, though his eyes retained their thoughtful intelligence. "Your annual reports have made a difference," he told her, keeping his voice low. 3 tribal delegations have been invited to Washington this year, including representatives from the Cheyenne. "Will 2 bears go?" Elizabeth asked, knowing how significant such recognition could be. Harrington nodded. "He's considering it. He asked if I thought you might accompany them as a translator." The request surprised and honored Elizabeth. "Of course I would, but surely there are official army translators available." "There are," Harrington acknowledged, "but none who understand both cultures as you do. 2 Bears trusts you to convey not just his words, but their proper meaning." Their conversation was interrupted by laughter from nearby, where the twins were entertaining younger children with stories and songs learned in St. Louis. Elizabeth watched them with maternal pride, still sometimes amazed by the confident young women they had become. "They remind me of that day with the Lakota," Harrington said, following her gaze. "Same courage, same natural ability to bridge worlds." That pivotal day remained vivid in Elizabeth's memory. Her terrified yet determined daughters riding between 2 bears and Lieutenant Harrington, white flag held high as they approached a war party prepared for battle. That single act of courage had not only prevented bloodshed, but had set the pattern for their future lives as mediators between cultures. "Speaking of the Lakota," Harrington continued, "Spotted Eagle sends his respects. His band has been settled near Pine Ridge for 3 winters now. He's established quite a reputation as a moderate voice in council." Elizabeth smiled at this news. The fierce war chief who had once planned to attack the Cheyenne camp had, like Harrington himself, found a different path forward. Their unlikely alliance, born of that near conflict, had created a pocket of relative peace in a region often torn by violence. "And Crawford's Mill?" she asked, referring to the settlement that had cast them out so cruelly a decade earlier. "Abandoned. 2 years ago," Harrington replied with satisfaction. "After Crawford was removed for his treatment of several families, not just yours, the settlement struggled. The last residents left when the railroad bypassed them for a route near Gray's Fork." There was a certain poetic justice in this outcome, though Elizabeth felt no vindictive pleasure. The cruel decision that had sent her family into a deadly blizzard had ultimately led them to a richer life than they might otherwise have known. Later, as the camp settled for sleep, Elizabeth sat with Sage Woman outside her lodge, sharing tea, as they had done countless evenings over the years. The elderly medicine woman was noticeably frailer than the previous summer, her once resonant voice now thin with age. "My journey in this world grows short," she said matter-of-factly. "Soon I will join my ancestors in the spirit lands." Though the words sent a pang through Elizabeth's heart, she did not contradict them. Sage Woman had lived nearly a century, had seen her people move from freedom to increasing confinement, had witnessed both cruelty and kindness from the whites who now dominated the land. She had earned her rest. "You have taught us so much," Elizabeth said softly. "Your wisdom will continue through all you've shared." Sage Woman patted her hand. "And through the Sunrise Sisters, who carry my knowledge in their hearts alongside their white learning." She looked toward the teepee where the twins now slept. "They stand at a crossroads, those 2. The path divides before them. Elizabeth had sensed this herself. "What do you see for them, Mother?" "Different trails, though both good," the old woman replied after a thoughtful pause. "One will remain more in your world, teaching many children about the people's ways. One will walk more in our world, healing with knowledge from both medicines." She smiled, "but always connected as twin spirits must be." The prediction aligned with subtle differences Elizabeth had observed developing between her identical daughters. Sarah showed greater interest in formal education and social reform, while Hannah was increasingly drawn to sage woman's healing practices and natural knowledge. "And you, bridge builder," sage woman continued, fixing Elizabeth with her penetrating gaze. "Your own path changes soon." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow in question. Over the years, she had learned to respect sage woman's insights, which often proved uncannily accurate. "People will need you more in the coming seasons," the elderly woman explained. "New threats come from the east, men with papers that take more land, more freedom. You will stand between these men and the people, speaking with the power of one who knows both hearts." The responsibility implicit in this prediction was daunting, yet Elizabeth did not shy from it. Her unique position as a respected white educator, with deep Cheyenne connections, had already placed her in similar roles on a smaller scale. "I will do what I can," she promised, "for as long as I'm needed." Sage woman nodded, satisfied. "This is why the Creator brought you to us through the snow, not just to save 3 lives, but to help save a people's ways from being forgotten." The next day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late spring morning on the prairie. Elizabeth rose early, as was her habit, and walked to the creek that bordered the camp. This quiet time alone had become her ritual during summer stays, a moment to reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought her family to this dual existence. As she watched the sun climb above the eastern horizon, casting golden light across the rippling grass, Elizabeth thought of Jonathan. He would have been 50 this year, perhaps grey at the temples, but still strong in body and conviction. Would he have approved of the path she had chosen for their family? She believed he would. His respect for the Cheyenne had been the seed from which their current life had grown. Movement caught her eye. 2 bears approaching along the creek bank, his step deliberately loud enough to announce his presence rather than startle her. Elizabeth smiled in welcome, appreciating this courtesy that reflected their long friendship. "You rise with the sun, as always," he observed, stopping beside her to gaze across the landscape that was changing year by year as more settlers arrived. "Old habits," Elizabeth replied. "Frontier life teaches early rising, even when one spends winters in a city." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who had moved from strangers to allies to family across a decade of shared experiences. "I have been asked to travel to the White Father's big lodge in Washington," 2 bears said finally, "to speak for the Cheyenne people about new treaties." "Captain Harrington mentioned it," Elizabeth nodded. "He said you might want me to accompany you as a translator." 2 bears turned to face her directly. "Not just as a translator, as counsel. You understand the ways white chiefs think, the words in their papers that take lands. You could help us see the traps before we walk into them." The request represented a profound trust, one Elizabeth did not take lightly. "I would be honored," she said simply. "When would this journey happen?" "When the leaves begin to turn. The White Father's Council meets then to decide the fate of many tribes." 2 bears looked troubled. "They speak of a new policy, to take children from their families, send them to far schools where they cannot speak Cheyenne words or follow Cheyenne ways." Elizabeth had heard rumors of these boarding school proposals, well-intentioned in the eyes of reformers who believed native children needed complete immersion in white culture to advance, but devastating to tribal communities already under immense pressure. "I'll help you fight this," she promised. There are better ways for children to learn new skills without losing their heritage. Our summer school here proves it's possible." Two Bears nodded. "Your small ones, not so small now, are living proof. They walk in both worlds with strong hearts." As if summoned by the reference, Sarah and Hannah appeared at the edge of camp, making their way toward the creek. In the early morning light, their identical features seemed to embody the bridge between cultures that their family had become. European features framed by hair styled in Cheyenne braids, moving with the confidence of young women secure in their complex identity. "We're heading to gather herbs with Morning Bird," Sarah called as they approached. Morning Bird, now a woman in her 30s with children of her own, had maintained her special friendship with the twins across the years. "Don't forget we promised to help with the children's lessons this afternoon," Elizabeth reminded them. Hannah grinned. "How could we forget? I've been practicing the new counting song all winter to teach them." As the twins continued on their way, Two Bears watched them thoughtfully. When they first came, scared small ones in the snow, who could have seen what they would become? "Not I," Elizabeth admitted. "I was simply trying to keep them alive. Everything that followed has been an unexpected gift. The best medicine often comes when we least expect it," Two Bears said, with the wisdom gained through a lifetime of leadership. "Your family has been good medicine for my people, as we have been for you." Elizabeth considered his words. Their unusual arrangement had indeed brought healing to both sides, helping her family recover from grief and abandonment, while providing the Cheyenne with an unexpected ally in their struggle to maintain their cultural identity in a rapidly changing world. As summer progressed, Elizabeth watched her daughters flourish once again in their Cheyenne home. Sarah worked alongside Two Bears' sons, documenting tribal history and governance systems that she would later incorporate into her studies at college. Hannah apprenticed more deeply with Sage Woman, her knowledge of both traditional remedies and modern medicine expanding under the elders' guidance. Elizabeth herself divided her time between teaching in the summer school, preparing for the Washington journey with Two Bears, and continuing her written record of Cheyenne traditions. This documentation had become increasingly important as government policies threatened to dismantle the very cultural foundations of tribal life. In quiet moments, she sometimes reflected on the stark contrast between her family's current existence and the desperate situation they had faced that winter day in Crawford's Mill. Cast out to die in a blizzard, they had instead found not just survival, but purpose, becoming living bridges between worlds that too often viewed each other only through lenses of fear and misunderstanding. The path had not been easy. They had faced prejudice from both sides, settlers who viewed their connection to the Cheyenne with suspicion, tribal members who initially doubted their commitment. Yet over years of consistent presence, of listening more than speaking, of respecting rather than imposing, they had earned a unique place of trust. One evening in late summer, as the first hints of autumn tinged the cottonwood leaves with gold, Elizabeth sat with her daughters on a hilltop overlooking the camp. Below them, the evening activities of the Cheyenne community unfolded, cooking fires being lit, children playing final games before darkness fell, elders gathering to share stories that connected present to past. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if Father hadn't died?" Sarah asked suddenly. "If we'd stayed at Crawford's Mill?" The question took Elizabeth by surprise. Her daughters rarely spoke of what might have been, focusing instead on the reality they had embraced. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "Your father would have continued building the settlement. You would have attended the local school, perhaps later a proper academy if we prospered. We would have lived a typical frontier life. We would never have known Two Bears or Sage Woman," Hannah mused, "never learned the Cheyenne language or their healing ways, never understood that there are different ways to see the world, all with their own wisdom." Sarah added, Elizabeth studied her daughters' thoughtful faces, marveling at the young women they had become, confident, compassionate, and uniquely equipped to navigate the complexities of a changing America. "Your father once told me that the measure of a life well lived is not in its comforts or even its length, but in its purpose," she said quietly. "He believed in building understanding between different peoples. I think he would be proud to see how we've honored that belief, even if the path has been very different than we might have planned." The twins exchanged one of their silent communications, that twin connection that had fascinated the Cheyenne from the beginning. "We wouldn't. Don't choose any other life," Hannah said with certainty, "even with its difficulties?" Elizabeth asked, knowing the challenges they had faced and would continue to encounter as people who didn't fit neatly into society's categories. Sarah smiled, her expression reflecting wisdom beyond her years. "Especially with its difficulties. What bridge stands without weathering storms?" As twilight deepened into night, the three women remained on the hilltop, watching stars appear in the vast prairie sky. Below them, the Cheyenne camp glowed with firelight, a beacon of resilience in a world of change. In the distance, the lights of the fort and trading post represented the inexorable advance of a different way of life. Between these two worlds, the Winters family had found not just a home, but a calling, as translators, teachers, healers, and witnesses to the possibility of understanding across the deepest divides of human experience. What had begun with cruelty, their abandonment, in a deadly winter storm, had led through compassion to transformation. A Cheyenne chief's decision to rescue three white strangers had rippled outward through time and circumstance, touching lives far beyond those directly involved and creating opportunities for healing where there might have been only conflict. In this, Elizabeth recognized a truth that transcended both the Christian teachings of her youth and the natural wisdom of the Cheyenne, that acts of genuine kindness, especially toward those different from ourselves, carry power beyond measure. Power to change not just individual lives, but the very course of understanding between peoples. As mother and daughters finally descended the hill to rejoin the camp below, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here, a journey that continued to unfold in ways she could never have imagined when she and her twin daughters stood abandoned in the snow, facing what seemed like certain death but proved instead to be an unexpected door to life. Some stories from the American frontier echo through time because they reveal truths about our shared humanity that transcend the divisions of history. The story of Elizabeth Winters and her twin daughters, cast out by settlers but saved by a Cheyenne chief, stands as testament to the power of compassion to transform lives and build bridges between worlds that too often saw only enemies rather than potential allies. Though their names appear in few official histories, their legacy lived on through the lives they touched and the understanding they fostered, proof that even in the darkest winter of prejudice and fear, unexpected kindness can plant seeds of hope that flourish long after those who planted them have returned to the earth, and in that legacy is a message that resonates still, that the boundaries we create between us and them are far more permeable than we believe, and that the simple decision to help rather than harm a stranger may ripple outward in ways we cannot foresee, creating possibilities for healing that extend far beyond our own horizon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.